Howdy y'all, welcome back to the farm. Today we're doing something really exciting. We've been doing a lot of work up until this point, getting this truck right here ready for the suspension upgrade, and it is finally time to get this thing started. So today what we have is we have parts from IronMan 4x4. We bought the IronMan 4x4 Stage 2 suspension lift, which means that we are lifting the back and the front by 2.5 inches, and we are going to install the new upper control arms, sway bar, end links, and the panhard bar. This is going to be a pretty extensive project. So while we've got it apart, we're also going to be rebuilding the lower control arms, meaning new front and rear control arm bushings, new lower ball joints, and changing out the tie rod in for an aftermarket tie rod. In the last video, you saw us install the spacers, which gave us more clearance for the Pro Comp wheels we're going to be putting on this thing. This suspension lift is actually going to make the clearance that we need for the 33-inch tires. They're the BFG KO2s that we're going to slap on those Pro Comps and shove up underneath this thing. All right, so with that, I'm going to jack this car up, get that wheel off, and I'll catch back up with you when we're ready to take things apart. We'll start by taking out the upper control arm bolt, the upper ball joint bolt, the sway bar linkage, one bolt here for the brake line, one bolt here for the brake line, the two camber bolts on both bottom sides of the lower control arm, and the two bolts down here for the lower ball joint. We're also going to be taking off the steering rod end link. So there's three cotter pins. There's three cotter pins on this side of the 4Runner. There's one up here for the upper ball joint, one here for the tie rod end link, and the one down here for the lower ball joint. The way I take these off is I use a pair of needle nose pliers and just get them started to where the ends are straight. And then once the ends are straight, I grab the big end and use my needle nose pliers and twist and pry it out. Just like that. So we're going to be replacing that cotter pin, so if you tear it up, it's not that big a deal. So sometimes with these cotter pins, they get crammed in there pretty tight. Sometimes I like to use a punch or a Phillips head screwdriver, get underneath that head and drive it in a little bit so the head comes out. And then once that head comes out a little bit, you can grab your needle nose pliers again and twist it out the rest of the way. All right, and the last one is here on the bottom. You're gonna be able to see it, but it's pretty much the same thing, where you've got the cotter pin sticking out one side, and the tail sticking out one side, and the head sticking out the other. All right, these cotter pins are pretty soft, so once you get them started, they'll just wrap right around your needle nose pliers for the most part. All right, there it is. That's the third one out. All right, now that you got all those out of there, we can start disassembling. It's pretty much just three bolt sizes, or three nut sizes. You got a 17, a 19, and a 22. So let's start with the 17s on the sway bar. It helps to get them on the right way. Okay, it helps when the sway bar doesn't move, but there you go, you got the sway bar nut, you get the other one. Sway bar is already disconnected from the other side, so you can see it's pretty loose back there. So the bottom two, there's two bolts down here at the bottom for the lower ball joint, they're 19s. One, two. So now this one's also a 19. I think this one back there, so you got that 12? Yep. So you got to use a 12 millimeter ratchet to take off these two little bolts. There's one back here, and they're very tight from the factory, and they just hold on these little brake line brackets. And I actually broke one of mine previously and had to replace it with this metric bolt. And it's actually a 13. There you go. So, like I said, mine's a 13, yours is going to be a 12. All right. And that way, the brake line doesn't bend. when this eventually comes apart. So what else we got? We got the two 22s, 22, 22, and then 19 for this. So let's go take those apart real quick.
Hey Dad.
Yeah.
If your girlfriend comes home smelling like honey in a white suit and covered in bee stings, you know one thing's for certain. She's a keeper.
Alright, that one comes off easy. Okay. Other swaybar end link. Sometimes these, if it's a part you're not going to use again, you can use some vice grips like this to grab the part, and then. So anyways, you can grab that shaft right there. If you're not going to use this part again, you can grab that shaft. It's going to keep the shaft from spinning in the boot. As you can see, these swaybar end links are completely toast. They're the same way on the other side. So we're going to be swapping those out. So take that out. You got to get that washer. And then once you take that shock out, this thing's going to try to fall. So it's good to have this supported by something. All right, put that 19 on the back one here. That's one piece of the camber bolt. Grab the other one under the boot. And it's going to be pretty tight. These are like over 100 foot-pounds back here. So we'll see if we can't break it loose. I forget that the nut on this end is part of the nut on this side is integrated into the sleeve. So you actually do take this bolt out and not the nut. Cool. So that's the big long bolt. So now let's take off this bolt here in the back. Okay. So, okay. Now that nut's free, we can take it off the end of the upper control arm. And then we only have one more, which is this guy back here. You got a 19 millimeter on the tie rod end link. Okay, cool. Just came right off. So now we can just start applying a little bit of pressure to get some of these pieces out. So we can tap this right here to get the upper ball joint loose. I'm not keeping this upper ball joint, which is why I'm hitting directly on here. But if you were going to keep your upper ball joint, you could put one of your castle nuts back on to protect the threads. So you could put it back on like this and then hit it from the bottom. Like that. And then get your castle nut off. So now the upper control arm's free. We've got the knuckle here. We can get the tie rod free. All right, so once again, we got a piece of wood down here to protect the rotor from the center block, and then we'll just take that off. And there's the tie rod end link. Once again, we are replacing this and the upper ball joint. So beating on the end of that stud, I wasn't too worried about. We're also replacing the camber joint, the lower control arm, and the bushings, and we're gonna have to press those out here in a bit. So now we've got most everything out of this. So you just gotta get these top hat bolts clear. So I'm just gonna put a little bit of thread lube up here, and then see if we can't get these guys loosened. Ye old breaker bar. That did it.
Dad, you need to make a meme where it's SpongeBob holding the old reliable case inside is a breaker bar.
What's old reliable?
Oh, it's a meme format where he's holding this case that's closed and it says old reliable on it. And in the show, he opens it and it's a spatula.
Yeah.
But people just poorly edit in different things, like a roll of duct tape or something like that.
All right, so we got these top two nuts loosened, and there's not a lot of room up here in the top of the fender guard. So I just do all this by hand, and so I'll just take these nuts out, and then we can take these bolts out of the bottom. You can see there is the first camber bolt. There's the first camber bolt. And odds are that second camber bolt is actually going to be stuck in place. So we might be cutting this bolt on the, we might be cutting the not the bolt, we might have to cut the sleeve that goes to the bushing on this side. But let's give it a pound and see what happens. I won't spend too much time on it though, because on the other side, it was rusted completely in there and there was no getting it out. Okay, that's one cap. And the other side is the spline cap. So let's see if we can hit it out. We got the bolt out of the bottom. We got the lower control arm free. We got the bolt out of the bottom of the shock. We're gonna continue taking the bolts out of this, and then the next thing you'll see me do is we'll come up here and talk about how to get the upper control arm bolt out. Way down here in the bottom, is where the upper control arm bolt comes out of. Now, from what I understand, they actually put this in at the factory before they put the entire front clip of the vehicle on. So they don't make it easy to pull this out. But what we're gonna do is work it out. And if you can, you might have the clearance here between the frame and the fender to pull it out. But you might have to bend the fender just a little bit. So that's what we're doing now. We're just getting a wrench up in there to get us some leverage. And then bending that fender around the bolt head so we can try to clearance it from the other side. Okay. Oh, I think we're past it. All right, so let's see if we can give this a little wiggle. Yep, there we go. All right. So hopefully we can clear this battery box too. So now we're stuck on this bracket here. Looks like it's held on by 10. Okay, and I'm trying to do this all without taking the battery tray. So there's my little 10mm bolt. We'll put it right there. Move this bracket out of the way and see if we can get this the rest of the way out. Oh, we're up against another cable. Clear the cable and the loom. And you also gotta keep pushing that fender washer back that holds it to the top bushing on the upper control arm. Inching it out. Look, we're so close. And it looks like we are gonna hit the battery tray, but this battery tray's got a little bit of flex in it. So let's give it a little wiggle and see if we can't get this the rest of the way out. Oh, we're close. Oh, baby. I'm gonna grab it from the bottom. There we go. That's the upper control arm bolt out. All right, so now I'm gonna go put this 10mm bolt back in that bracket, because when we install this, we're gonna install this from the back going this way so that we don't have to do that again. All right, let's go back to the bottom. All right, so now we're back on the bottom. There's your upper control arm out. Sway bar is out. Bottom shock is free. Bottom control arm is free. It's stuck on something. Let's just give it a little tap. Okay. There we go. All right. So the shock and lower control arm came out all at once. We'll get this strut out. There's the strut. And I mean, the cool thing is, once you got everything out of the way, it all starts falling apart. So I'll make sure this axle stays in place. Make sure you support this, support the top of this knuckle, so you're not tweaking these brake lines. These brake lines aren't attached to the knuckle right now. We did that so we'd have more clearance in the back, but you definitely don't want this knuckle swinging side to side, as it'll want to, because the hub will rotate free. So I'll just wrap it around the strut tower here until we're ready to put the new strut in. Okay, cool. So that's supported. How about we get get that saber saw over here and get to cutting. All right, so I eat my words. This is actually not rusted through, and we didn't get started on cutting yet. So I'm just gonna push this out. I don't know how I'm gonna push it out, but I'm gonna do a pushing. How do you think we're gonna do it? I don't know either. Here, how about like this? What if I use this? Oh! Oh man, that's friggin' magical, dude. Well, how do you think we get that out? I mean, heck, we're heckin' close.
I'm gonna say it.
I'm gonna say it, Hank.
I'm heckin' mad.
I'm heckin' mad. Well, dude, this is awesome. We just gotta figure out how to get this thing, out. Oh yeah, boy! That is sick! Oh, we get to reuse that.
But you already bought the new one.
I'm gonna return the new one and just reuse this one. So let's press all this together, but wham bam, thank you, man. So we'll just smash that back together, and then boom, we got our alignment set, all set up. I'm super excited about not having to destroy that. Heck, now that we don't have to use the Sawzall,
take it all out.
that's it. All right, it's all apart. Now let's go over to the press and start pressing out this junk. Since we got the lower control arm off, we're gonna go ahead and get started on the tie rod end. I'm gonna mark here on the end, but this jam nut's not gonna move. We're gonna do this without moving that jam nut, so that when we go to put the tie rod end on, it doesn't have to be perfect. So there's gonna be a lot of things that we have to get close to alignment, but we won't be able to get into a perfect alignment. So what we're gonna do is use that jam nut as the backstop for this tie rod end, so that we can put the new tie rod end all the way up next to that jam nut. So what I've got is I've got a 14 millimeter wrench and I've got my 19 millimeter wrench. And what I need to do is try to loosen up that tie rod end. Now it is going to be tough, but I've got to push up on this 14, push down on this 19, and loosen this thread that goes all the way through here. We were able to get this loosened, and now that we got this loosened, we can take the 14 millimeter back on the back, the 19 millimeter on the tie rod end, and get the rest of the way off. That's all the old parts out. With all the old parts out, push out the bushings and ball joint on this lower control arm, and then put all the new parts in. All right, let's head over to the press and do this lower control arm. What I found best for pushing out the bushings is to press on this all thread here, and then to burn the bushing out. You got to burn the rubber between the two metal sleeves to get it out. I've just found that that's what's working here, so we're going to try that again. So I'm going to get it to where there's some pressure. All right, and once there's some pressure, we can start melting that black rubber. I'm going to get this door open and clear the area of anything flammable, and then we'll just start melting the bottom. So once this starts burning, I'm going to just let it burn. I'm going to get away from it so I'm not breathing in fumes. Last time I did this, it maybe took like 10 minutes aside, and I would just light it, put some pressure on it, walk away, let it burn, light it, walk away. I'm watching it the whole time, but really there's not much to it but just to let the rubber burn out so that we can get the bushing pieces out of there. So after we burn out the middle of the bushings and push the middle of the bushing out, we're left with this bushing sleeve that's pretty tight inside the ends of the lower control arms. There's gonna be one on each side. So to get that out, what we did is we scored it on the inside with the reciprocating saw so that we cut through the sleeve. And then we took a wide punch, went down the crack, and drove it out. We did the other side, and it took much longer. But this side, by cutting that score on the inside of the sleeve and then driving it out with the punch, we found was the best way to knock these out. While we got this apart, we're going to clean out the inside of these bushing seats on the lower control arm, and we're going to use a wire wheel on the end of our impact driver. afterwards we'll actually get this whole thing once over with the wire cup before we paint it. But before we do all that, let's go ahead and take apart this lower ball joint. So to start taking apart the lower ball joint, we'll actually take a 24mm socket. Now remember, we took this cotter pin off earlier. We didn't have to take it off when it was under the car. We could take it off now, but in our case it's already off. We'll take this 24mm socket and get this off. Okay, nut off. We can just loosen our vise a little bit and get both sides of the lower ball joint connector on the vise, and then drive this bolt out. There we go. So we'll save that, we'll reuse that piece. And now, before we go back to the press, we're gonna go ahead and get this clip off the top. Before we go over to the press, to press this lower ball joint out, we're gonna remove this retaining clip. It's a little bit like a snap ring, but it doesn't actually have holes on it. So to get it out, what we do is we're gonna take two flathead screwdrivers and just drive them under each. There's not a lot of force holding this on. So you'll notice that just by driving the screwdriver under each side, we're actually gonna hold it like this, hold it like this. And once you've got it off a little bit, you can just take your screwdriver and work it the rest of the way off. Don't laugh. And it's right there next to Shawnee's feet. So now that we've got that snap ring off, we actually don't need it here. Oh, thanks, son. Yeah. So we got the snap ring off. Now that we got this off, we can head over and press this out. This actually takes quite a bit of force. So before we get that, we are going to spray it down with some penetrating oil, and then we'll support it up on the press to press this out. I do have a lower ball joint, a ball joint press kit. That will work, but you will need, my kit did not come with the fitting to fit on to fit around this lower ball joint. This lower ball joint is 2.5 inches, so you need a slightly larger or slightly smaller cup than what comes in the standard kit. What came with this was a 2-inch and a 3-inch cup. So we're gonna get up there. We'll support the top of this and start pressing this out. On the internet, that's where the hackers are.
I caught that on camera. I started the recording to see if I could. I just started it to make sure I got everything right. Make sure I...
Yeah, right. You were like, I know what my dad's gonna say. They talk about internet hackers. I just gotta get this thing set up in this press because it will go wonky. On the other one, when I did this, the blocks would slip out all the time. So what I've done is I'm hitting these with a hammer to make sure that this block is as close to the inside of this lower ball joint seat as I can get it. That way when we start pressing it, it's less likely to slip out because it was slipping out before. And we never got so much force on it that it would like jump out at me, but it is kind of scary when it pops loose. So we just want to make sure it's as tight in there as we can get it. Okay, so you just want to make sure everything's tight. And the other thing is, this whole thing is kind of at an angle. This whole thing's kind of at an angle. So you want to make sure that you're applying pressure as close to straight down as you can so that this thing doesn't bind up inside the seat. All right, let's see if we can get it out now. Yes, sirree, Babaroo. That'll do it. So yeah, like I said, we had to go back and forth to the bench a couple of times. Just hit it with the sledgehammer to get it started, but sledgehammer, some heat, and some penetrating oil got it to start. And then once it got started, it was easier to set it on this. If you've got a 2.5-inch piece of pipe or a 2.5-inch cup, it's going to fit the bottom of this seat, and you'll be able to push it out way easier than I just did. But I think that's the key to getting this thing out of there, is having that good seat right there on the inside. All right, so the next step is we're going to clean this up with a wire wheel, and then we'll start putting it back together. All right, so lower control arms all taken apart, and we cleaned it up, and now we're just letting some paint dry. We put some Rust-Oleum rust reformer on it. So while we're doing that, we're going to throw in some of the other parts
that we need to build this front end. So I got the tie rod in, the new one. We took the old one off. So this one's a greasable tie rod in. So I'm going to go ahead and put this grease nib on the back. You don't got to put it on too tight. You just want to get it to where it's hand tight in there. We'll call that good. We're going to grease all these things up at the end. So I'm not going to worry about greasing it up now. And then I'm going to take this. Remember, we left our nut on there as a backstop. That nut on there right there. So we're going to take this and just put it right on. Now, I'm not going to put any Loctite on this one. I put Loctite or thread lock on most of the suspension bolts. In fact, we're going to put them on almost every bolt we put back in is going to get a small bit of blue Loctite just to help it from rattling out. But this one, because it's going to be part of the alignment that I'm eventually going to have done at the shop, I'm not too worried about putting Loctite on this one because it is going to get adjusted. So I'm just going to put that all the way back in until it backs up to the 19 millimeter nut in the back. All right, and once it's there, I'm going to take a 20 millimeter wrench and a 19 millimeter wrench. Put the 22 millimeter wrench on the tie rod and the 19 millimeter wrench. Tighten it up. All right, hand tight, that's perfect. And then we can line it up with the bolt hole on the back of the knuckle and get it up in there. All right, so once that's lined up, we can use the nut to suck it up the rest of the way. We'll go ahead and put the nut on loose now. So as I'm assembling everything, the very last step for all this is going to be torquing all the bolts to their torque spec. So for the time being, I'm just going to take a lot of these nuts and bolts and put them in loosely so it all just kind of fits together and it's not precariously balancing on this cinder block. Okay, great. So now I've got that piece on. All right, now the next piece I'm going to put on is actually going to be the strut in before I put the upper control arm in, so I can take advantage of all this extra space I've got to get that strut in. So here's the strut. It goes in like this with the one bolt on the inside and the two bolts on the outside. So get it up in there behind the gear. Great. Get those bolt holes lined up. So this all came with new hardware. So I'll take the new nuts. They're all lock nuts, so they got the nylon sleeve in there. Once again, just to help things from rattling out. And I'll just get them started on the top of this top hat here. We won't even tighten it down to the nylon sleeve. We'll just get this started so it doesn't come falling out on us. Another thing you want to take into consideration when you're putting this together, take into consideration when you're putting this back together is that if it's loose, a little bit of loose gives you some wiggle room when it comes to making sure that all the pieces made up. So making sure that the bottom of the strut tower mates up to the lower control arm. Making sure the lower control arm bolts aren't so bound up that you can't line up the lower ball joint to the steering knuckle. Just all those stuff like that. Just things to keep in mind while you're putting it back together. You don't want to skip to tightening things before everything fits. All right, great. Great, so now we've got that in place. And we can put the upper control arm in. Now before we put this in, this retaining bolt right here that holds the brake line in place, it's actually a little bit bigger than the stock bolt. So what we're going to do is take I think it's a 5/16 inch drill bit and actually re-drill that hole right there. So we're going to drill it a little bit bigger. Perfect. So that hole is just a little bit bigger. That'll make it easier to put that bolt in when it's all up there in place. Okay, so now we'll take the new cotter pin and the new nut off real quick and then get it all lined up in place. Now remember, I said that for our installation, we put this back in, we're going to install this instead of with the bolt going down this way, we're going to have the bolt coming up this way. That way, we don't have those same clearance issues in the front if we ever have to take this apart again. We'll get it started in this end down here. All right, now it's coming up the top side. Cool. All right, bolts all the way through. Now all we gotta do is get the washer and nut on, just loose for now, and then we'll torque it down when we tighten up everything else. And this bracket's a little tight, but just start it over on one side and just rock it to the other. You might have to bend it a little bit, but it'll fit pretty well in the same place on the upper control arm. Before we get back to torquing things in the wheel well, we're gonna go ahead and put together the rest of this control arm. As you can see, this control arm looks a lot better. We painted, we degreased it, we got all the dust and dirt off of it, got all the old paint off of it, and then we sprayed it with Rust-Oleum's Rust Reformer. We're really not looking for much other than a little bit of protection from rust from the paint that we removed, and to make it look a little nicer before we put it back in. So the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna press in the front and rear bushing and press in the lower ball joint. Now this is gonna be a lot easier than pressing them out because it's all new parts, doesn't have all that rust buildup, and we're gonna put a little bit of anti-seize on the bushing sleeve and on the outside of the lower ball joint. The metal sleeve, the steel sleeve, and the steel seat, and they're supposed to sit together real tight. And in doing so, any rust that builds up, any corrosion at all, creates enough tension to where it is very difficult to press out. And that's why we had to cut and grind so many of these parts out of the lower control arm, because the lower control arm is subject to a lot of weather. There is a lot of moisture, there is a lot of dirt that can get up in those bushing sleeves, and this is going to help displace a lot of that moisture and prevent that corrosion over time. I don't know if we'll ever have to do this again, but if we do, I'd rather have the anti-seize in there than not, to prevent all of the effort that I had to go through to push it out the first time. It's going to be really uncommon to have anti-seize installed on something that comes from the factory, which is why the first time you end up replacing parts, it's so much more difficult than the next time after you put some of this anti-seize grease on. And before we do the lower ball joint, we'll just press these in real quick. Now these bushings have different sizes. They only fit one way, and we're going to install them the exact same way they went in, which was the wide end on the outside. Take the rear seat, you take the wide bushing, you slide it in there to get started. Oh wow, that fits in there perfectly. We're just gonna take a little bit of force to seat that all the way, but that went all the way in, or almost all the way in.
I am speedy.
Cool.
Yeah, well it's seated now. All right, let's do the other side.
Just as easy.
Just as easy, let's see. That one's got a little bit more, that one needs a little bit more of a push than the top one did. The next step in this process, once again, nothing in here is torqued down except for our LCA, our lower ball joint here is torqued down, but everything else is gonna get torqued and Loctited before we put it all together. So the next step is putting this lower control arm back into its original place and lining up the bushings with the holes. Now I did a poor job of lining them up right there, but it's because without a bolt in there, they may just fall out. So I'm gonna go ahead and start with the front. Now, like I said, I was worried that I might have to cut the front sleeve, but I didn't. So what I did instead was just cleaned up this sleeve a little bit. This sleeve starts in the front like this, and then this goes on the rear like that, and then the bolt goes through the whole thing. Now, before we put it in there, we are going to put some anti-seize on this sleeve so that the next time I have to take this apart, it's not frozen in place.
because I'm super stoked that I got to save this one. Yeah, instead of just having to cut through like I did the other side. I did get another sleeve for the other side so that I can replace the greasable joint with this one, because that greasable sleeve is actually the wrong size camber plate. Yeah, Moog is the company that I bought all this from, but I bought a lot of these parts from. They make some okay aftermarket stuff. It's pretty reasonably priced. I bought all this stuff from Rock Auto, so it is what it is. All the parts your car ever needs, and some of them it doesn't. I'm gonna get crammed up in here for a bit, and we are going to see if we can't line up the hole so that the sleeve can slide on through. Oh, did we get it the first try? Do we have a rubber mallet? Nope. So we're nearly through on this side. We just gotta get it the rest of the way in. Cool. And then we'll take our other plate. This is the part that's got the key so that it faces the right way. You put it in here and you can't see it, but it goes around the other side like that. And now we're gonna put a little bit of anti-seize on the bolt that goes through the sleeve. Now, I didn't have any trouble getting this bolt out, but once again, I just don't want to take that chance in the future, because I have had these suspension bolts get rusty on me, and they are a bear to pull out of those sleeves. Because if you think cutting through a sleeve is tough, man, cutting through the whole bolt is a nightmare. So got a little bit of that rusty peanut butter on there. And then I'll get it started. So like I said, we'll torque that one down, but this one is gonna get loosened and retorqued by the guys that do the alignment. This will all need an alignment. I don't know if that goes without saying or not, but once you make this much change to your suspension, you really should take it in to get it professionally aligned. We're gonna try to get it close. I'm not gonna show you how, because I'm not gonna be able to advise you on how to get it that close, but we're gonna make it safe enough for us to drive a few miles into town so we can get this all aligned. See what I'm talking about? See all that rust? I'm gonna knock this off real quick, but I swear, if I don't knock this off, that's the kind of thing that gets corroded to the inside of the bushing. So we're gonna go clean that up real quick. So look how much cleaner that is. It's so much better. So we got all that rust knocked off, well, most of the rust knocked off that middle part. Slather it with some anti-seize grease. That rusty peanut butter is gonna keep that from being a problem in the future. So this goes on the back like this. If you've got the armor on, I had to take the front armor piece off for some clearance issues with this front piece, but that back armor piece does provide a little bit of a clearance issue right there. Get your burr gun on it. We're gonna get the strut attached to the lower control arm, because once you get the strut attached to the lower control arm, it's kind of the last bit holding all together, and then we can torque up everything else. We'll torque the tie rod to 66. I think the lower, what are these bolts down here? The lower ball joint bolts. I think they're 100. So I think this is 66. This is 100. I think this is 80. And I think this is 87, the upper control arm. So I'm going to go ahead and get this torque, get the strut installed. And then we'll use the jack to jack up the lower control arm so we can attach the lower ball joint to the steering knuckle. So we got all those nuts torqued up. We got everything put back together, and we got the wheels back on. And this is where we are. This thing is a monster. It's now almost chest height with me, and we haven't even done the back end. So the next thing I'm going to do is back this thing out and then back it back in so we can work on the back end facing all of our tools and not have to worry about the shop doors. And then we'll just get started tearing apart the back. But the back is going to be drastically easier than the front. The front end had all kinds of extra parts. We needed to rebuild all of the lower control arms. We pressed out the bushings, the ball joints. There were so many more pieces to the front than are on the back. And even though we're putting in that new panhard bar and new swaybar end link
extensions, it's gonna be so much easier. So let's get this thing flipped around. We'll start tearing things apart and catch you back up so you can see what we're taking out of the rear. All right, so now we're in the back. The way we've got this jacked up is we've got jack stands supporting the frame and our floor jack is supporting the axle. We're just doing that so we can raise and lower the axle while we're taking off these suspension pieces. So we've already taken off the 14 millimeter nut that holds the top of the sway bar end link. Next we're gonna do is take off the 17 millimeter nut on the back of the sway bar end link. We're probably going to sawzall through the top of this. We're replacing this. It's completely shot. There's oil coming out of it. So we're just going to saw off the top of that so we don't have to worry about that nut. And then that's a 17 if you're interested. We're not going to use a 17. And then the bottom bolt down here on the bottom of the strut is 17. And then this panhard bar, we're going to replace with an aftermarket panhard bar that's going to help us make up for the adjustment we're going to need for the extra height in the back. So this is a 19 millimeter nut. We'll just take that out and then drive it through the other way. We've already taken the 14 millimeter nut off the other side. That's why the sway bar has so much more give. The other side was challenging because you had a gas tank in the way, but on this side, we're going to be able to get our impact driver on the back of the sway bar end link to help us get that off. All right, so that's the plan. I'm going to go ahead and get started taking all this apart and catch back up with you when it's time for us to drop the axle. We've got all of our pieces out. The sway bar's out, struts out, panhard's out. So the next thing we need to do is take this spring out. Now, what we've done is we've already lowered the floor jack to where we're not stretching out the brake lines because we want to make sure that our brake lines do not have stress on them so they don't snap on us during this install. So the floor jack, we've relaxed it. It's still being held up by these links here. So to get this spring out, you push down on this side of the axle, pick up on the spring, and then it should just fall on out. Now we're going to reuse this cup. So set this cup to the side, or this bump stop. And you're going to want to, this is a great opportunity to clean up. Can you give me that brush?
Yeah.
This is a great opportunity to clean up any dirt that accumulates in here, because down here on the spring seat, there's dirt that you're not going to be able to get to outside of this install. So we knocked that dirt off of there. Now the install of your spring is just the opposite of what we just did. You're going to take your spring, put the bump stop in the top of it, and then the same operation, you push down here and you push this spring into place. You'll note that on the bottom of the spring, you've got this tail here. That matches up with this slot on the spring seat on bottom. So we're going to try to do this on film. It might not be real easy to capture, but that's what we're going to do. We're going to take this spring and do just the opposite of what we just did, where we push down and then feed the spring up. Okay. All right, there we go. So you just want to make sure that, like I said, that the tail fits in that slot right there, and that your bump stop, there's a circle up top that it fits in, and you just want to make sure that it's lined up with that circle in the top. And that's the spring. And honestly, this is the hard part. The other side's going to be a lot harder because once you put in the first spring, you have to counteract the force of that spring on the other side. But you can use another jack on this side to jack up this corner so that that corner's lower. You just got to be careful when you're using a jack to lift things up that you're not coming off your jack stands. All right, so we're going to go on to the other side now and do the other one and then start putting this back together. So we got started on the other side already. On the other side, we've got the strut and sway bar end link connected. That way we know the height of the sway bar end link on this side. It's still loose, and we'll do some final adjustments at the very end. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to take the sway bar end link kit, and we're going to use the bigger of the two bolts that fits the sway bar end link hole here, and this sway bar end link. So you take the top nut, which is now a 17 millimeter nut, put it right up through here like this. And it helps if you have the bushing on top so that you can push it through because there's not a lot of space back there. I really don't know how people normally do this part because there's not a lot of space in this wheel well. So y'all have to let me know in the comments if you've done this before, if people cut this part of the wheel well out, but I'm trying to maintain it, at least for our purposes. So we've got this started on top, and we'll get the bottom started as well. And then a little bit later, I'll take measurements from here to here, and we'll make this sway bar end link and the other sway bar end link the same, so we've got the same balance going on either side. But for now, we are going to tighten down this top nut. So like I said, that's a 17. Before we do that, we'll get the rest of this stuff in place. So the strut goes over the strut mount sleeve on the bottom. So now get your strut hardware out and get this ready. We're going to be installing this like type 2 in the instructions. And type 2 says you get a bottom washer, a bushing, and then you put that on here, and then on the top of the mount you put the other side of the washer, the bushing, and the other washer like this. So we'll just line everything up, cut that, and get all of the stuff on. Now it's not too hard to push that back down if you need to. So cool. And then a bushing. If you don't drop it, you're not doing it right. That's what they say. And you gotta drop it on top of the muffler
To make sure.
to make sure it's good and lost. After crawling around on the floor of the shop for the last 5 minutes, we finally got that nut started on there. So that nut gets started on at the 17 millimeter nut, and you tighten that down until you get a bulge out on the bushings, similar to what they show in the instructions. And then the last thing is this panhard bar. We're going to extend this out a little bit because we are under pressure. We are under load right now because of the jack. So we're going to line it up now. So once we get that, so we are under pressure. The jack is holding up the axle until the axle is supporting the weight of the truck. And at this point, we can go ahead and put the bolt through and set the length of the panhard bar, and then take each of these set nuts and jam them up against the edge of the panhard bar. All right, we're through the other side. And now we can tighten this down. Now I've kept from tightening all this down because what I want to do is I want to tighten it all down so I've got the right length, I got the right set, all that's going to be set up right. So what I'm going to do now is start tightening this, tighten this top bolt down for my sway bar end links, tighten this top nut down for the sway bar end links, and then measure from here to here and get that to be the same on both sides. Tighten down that top nut there, tighten down this bolt down here at the base, and tighten down that panhard bar, and then we are done. After that, it's time to throw the wheels on and take a look at what it looks like. This is finally done. We've been working on this for a few weeks, and it's been such a labor to get it done in the short amount of times we've been able to work on it, but it's so exciting to finally see this thing sitting up on this lift. This lift makes this truck look huge. I mean, it's dynamite. And so far, the little driving that I've done, it feels great. We tightened everything up, threw the tires on, and just drove it on out of there. We also greased up the tie rod ends and the ball joints underneath because they hadn't been greased yet, so we put some grease in them. And then we just drove it. And honestly, like I said, it's awesome. The truck feels great, so much clearance underneath. Next thing we gotta do is throw those 33s up under there. So stay tuned for that. I'm really looking forward to the extra tire lift we get from throwing those bigger wheels and tires underneath this thing. So if you like this video, let me know by liking it. If you've got a question, something I didn't cover, I know some of the things I went over real quick. So if you've got any questions, let me know in the comments below. I'm happy to get back to those. And if you like this video and want to see others like it, consider subscribing. If you don't like what I did and I did something wrong, tell me about that too. Because no one seems afraid to tell me. And I appreciate it when I get some advice that I didn't consider. So thanks again for coming along, and I'll see you next time. Bye now.